what is your opinion on Brazilian Prime Minister Bolsonaro regarding, there's a lot of things in here, deforestation of the rainforest? P.S. I'm a Christian, I'd bake you a cake, though. I don't know enough about him, but it sounds like he really hates Marxism, and he's really pushing Brazil to become more of a world leader, and that he actually is for capitalism, and he's trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him a day or two ago. So on that front, and I don't know a ton about him, that all sounds good to me. And as a Christian, I appreciate your offer to bake me a cake. That would be very nice of you. Thank you very much.
Yes, folks.
Oh, yeah.
Left Reckoning 91. I wonder if Dave's got an opinion of Bolsonaro yet. Because I have one. He's a loser. He's
big
a loser.
I didn't realize we've seen that clip so many times, Matt, and I didn't realize that he calls him the prime minister. Which far be it for me to get too worked up about that kind of thing, but that's very fucking funny now.
Yeah, look, I'm gonna hold off on criticizing him on that one because that is a pitfall of broadcasting. But he knows enough to know that he hates Marxism, and he actually likes capitalism and is going to do enough to get the woke stuff out of schools. But he's a loser, like Trump. He's a loser. He's a one-term president. So both Trump and Bolsonaro, I mean, unlike even George W. Bush or like Bill Clinton, like they lose after one. So I don't know what you can say about this right-wing populism. But
hopefully it's Creston, but I don't want to celebrate too early. I mean, we got a lot of fun stuff. I will just say really quick, because it's been on the top of my head and tip of my tongue for a long time during the live show too, and I wasn't able to get to it. One of my favorite memories of when Trump was president and Bolsonaro was president in Brazil was that whenever Bolsonaro had like a big scandal, Trump would unfollow him for a period of time and then would refollow him back up, which was, I don't know, based and cucked for Bolsonaro. But luckily, hopefully his political reign is over and he might be riding off into the sunset or into a hospital bed. We'll have to find out very soon.
Slinking away, not really admitting defeat, but saying I'll respect the Constitution. I mean, and not even reaching over for the wheel of your Secret Service transportation, which Trump denies and the Secret Service denies, but I believe it in my heart. I believe that Trump actually was fighting, as a patriot would, against what he believed to be election theft by this dastardly Lula and in that case Joe Biden.
Well, we're going to get to this main story because it's going to be a little tough not to, but just really quick, later in the show, we are going to be joined by Deep State Kuba. Those of y'all who saw us in LA will recognize him. Those of y'all who are regular listeners of This Is Revolution podcast have certainly heard him. But he joined us a little bit to talk about the deep state, how the left sometimes doesn't understand those apparatuses and what we can do to fight back against it. Really fun conversation, and we'll certainly have him on again very soon. And then immediately after the main show, we are going to be hanging out in the post games. To get access to that at patreon.com/leftreckoning. So make sure that you join us there. You can leave us a voicemail and all of that. So don't make sure that you're not missing out on all the fun. But Matt, I mean, I don't know. Doing a pitch on all that stuff is important, but we got some pretty big news to get to. We got to celebrate a little bit, don't we, Babo?
Oh yeah.
After all of these years, let's make sure we can get this in the mic. Are you doing it too?
Well, I don't have a beer.
Matt's got a Coca-Cola. Very American.
No.
There you go. That's even better.
I'll be drinking Black Label out of a Johnny Walker glass. So
there you go, friend.
Very American.
But we're celebrating. Cheers to Lula da Silva. Cheers to the people of Brazil for winning against one of the most frightening and devastating far-right movements that we've seen pop up. I mean, we always, we had a lot of hope that once Lula decided he was going to run again, that this was going to happen. It got very scary as we were getting closer So a quick cheers before we get into some of the analysis. I could not be happier. I've had a smile paint on my face for the past 2 days.
Yeah, I'll be my smile. Yeah, cheers. I was concerned when I started seeing the stuff and with the roadblocks,
Yeah.
and the cops. I'm like, God damn, man! Like, even despite like the Biden saying we want a free and fair election, they're going to go for it, and ultimately not enough. And like, you can have a little bit, but ultimately they would have needed the military for a coup. And as that became, and you texted me, you were actually the first person that broke the news to me that that he had passed him in the count. And yeah, I mean, it's such a long journey. Like, I remember the very first time in like 2016, I think it was, that Michael introduced this whole Lula business to me, and scheduled his Thursday on Majority Reports around guests discuss Lula's legacy and then the persecution of the guy, and now to see him actually achieve a victory like that is it's it's a good feeling.
It's a really good feeling. I mean, for the people of Brazil, for the Amazon, for the world, really. I mean, Lula has been such an important figure in modern times, but he was also a very important figure in what we've talked about along the show, the pink tide. And we might not be doing any kind of guesswork about whether or not we're in another pink tide, but this is a huge victory for, again, like, one, I think first and foremost, the Brazilian people. But Brazil's a big country that has a lot of effects around the world. So this is a really big victory, I think, for the left, for particularly working class people, and for the environment. So I think everybody watching already knows the results here. Lula won with 100% reporting, with 60 million plus votes to Bolsonaro's 58 million votes. Now, it was, within a percentage point. It was a closer election than I think a lot of us would have liked. And we'll talk about what's going to be next. But I think it's also important for us to be able to celebrate when it's time to celebrate. And this is one of those times. And there's so many great videos that I've seen, and like the enthusiasm. I mean, I don't know. I'm not the biggest Joe Biden fan, if people gathered. And I remember when Biden beat Trump, feeling actually very alienated by some of the celebrations. But they are nothing in comparison to some of the outpouring of support that we've seen in the streets in Brazil. And we're just going to play this one from our good friend Brian Muir, who I think definitely has been, if I've had a grin painted on my face for the past couple of days, I can't imagine how ecstatic Brian has been. But this is Brian celebrating with some folks after the news came out. And I want to play that all the way to the end, because if you see those fingers up at the end, are Brian, who's definitely partaking. The whole facade of like neutral journalists be damned. Brian's in there celebrating, as he should be.
Yes, I just said there's a little bit too much posturing about neutrality, and I'm a view from nowhere about these Brazilian politics. I don't know between Lula and Bolsonaro. I think we got to just make sure we call balls and strikes. The strikes are with Lula, and that's who you support, and that's what I like to see from my journalists. Yeah, that was great.
But again, like, I mean, one thing, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this stuff, but this is a little bit of a celebration video. I mean, I'm so grateful. One, for the work that Michael did in this country, like really representing and making this an issue. I mean, that is one of his larger impacts, I think, in American politics. Like, you even have kind of like cowardly Democrats now investigating Lava Jato and the American role there, right? And that's something spurred that, and I think that it's a very accurate thing to say that Michael played a role, if not a very large role, in that. But also just,
I mean, can I just jump in there? Like
yeah.
Brian mentioned in our interview, he talked about these sort of machinations behind the scenes. Maybe not the most recent one, maybe it was one before, but behind the scenes to get members of Congress to issue statements beforehand to basically head off any sort of Bolsonaro, to make sure Bolsonaro knows he doesn't have any sort of wink, wink, like go for it opportunity. And Brian credited Michael with that, and I mean, we know that there are people we can influence that, like, especially in this ecosystem in general, that we are influencing, that hear it.
Mm-hmm. And like, certainly most of the people watching, and myself included, I mean, playing a huge role, not only pointing out the injustice of Lava Jato and the lawfare attacks against Lula, but also helping people recognize how important of a leader and how important and revolutionary and radical this movement has the potential of being. But I mean, before we get into, I'm going to break down a little bit of the history for folks who might not know it very well. Before we get into all of that, let's just go to the man himself. This is Lula. This is going to be translated, folks. So if you're listening, you can find this pretty easily. But this is
On
Lula's
our Twitter account.
On our Twitter account. This is Lula's victory speech, and we'll just play some clips from it for y'all.
Nesse 30 de outubro histórico, a maioria do povo brasileiro deixou bem claro que deseja mais e não menos democracia. O novo Brasil que queremos construir a partir de 1º de janeiro não interessa apenas ao povo brasileiro, mas a todas as pessoas que trabalham pela paz, a solidariedade e a fraternidade em qualquer parte do mundo. O Brasil é a minha causa, o povo é a minha causa, e combater a miséria é a razão pela qual eu vou viver até o fim da minha vida.
Yeah, and like, I think we'll play some more good Lula speeches as this segment goes on, but I think it's good to remind folks that Lula is a very damn good speaker. One at like really laying things out, I think, very clearly. When we talked before the first round elections, we played a clip of him, like in one sentence, 2 sentences tops, explaining like Marxist theory of exploitation, right? And like the role of the state in suppressing working class people and bolstering the ruling class and the capitalist class. He is extremely unique in his ability as a politician to, one, not only be charismatic, but two, to pack a lot in there. But before we jump into all this stuff, I just want to take a second to remind everybody of how far we've come, like what this represents. Going all the way back, because I think a lot of Americans forget this, Brazil was a country that within living memory was under military dictatorship. And the choice between these two fellows could not be any more clear. During the military dictatorship, which was something that Bolsonaro not only loved, but was a fervent supporter of, Lula was a trade union leader, right? Lula is was injured as a worker. This is somebody who comes from the working class. This is not somebody who got a fancy degree and decided to sort of like sit on an origin story. This is somebody who comes very clearly rooted out of the working class movement. Lula was a trade union leader during the dictatorship, faced incredible repression during that period of time. He ran for president multiple times after the dictatorship ended and did not win. He did not win, especially in his first, second attempts, did not even come close. But he did not abandon the fight. And he eventually won and became the president of Brazil. And he massively improved the lives of Brazilian people through state investment and programs like Bolsa Familia, right, which provided food and funding to poor working class families in Brazil. So much so that when you go back and you look at the records, you can actually see the improvement in people's lives, right? You see it in heights. You see it in literacy levels. I mean, this is real deal. You talk about bread and butter politics. That's what Lula has been doing his entire political career. And during this period of time, he made tactical decisions, right? I'm just saying this, because Michael would get mad at me because I just turned 30, so I don't know if I can still call myself young anymore. But I came from
the young Republicans. By the young Republican standard, you're still young. So anyway,
okay,
continue.
We'll I'll hold myself to that standard. But I came from a left socialist movement that was very like much we're reading about history and not engaged in politics, if that makes sense. So I have my criticisms of Lula, right, that came from people like David Harvey and other folks, right? And Michael really didn't like that. And I bring that up to say, like, when Lula was president, he made tactical decisions to do all of these benefit programs for the poor while trying to maintain, a level of GDP growth, economic programs that allowed for the rich in Brazil to continue amassing incredible fortunes, right? And I bring that up just to say, not to criticize Lula. This is actually one of the most important things about understanding about Lula's politics and his role, but to say that wasn't even enough, right? Like, Lula improved the lives of poor and working class people, and the people at the top of that society did very well. But that wasn't enough. He said, Lula said at one point, a complaint that he heard from a rich Brazilian was that the airports in Brazil now look like bus stations, which is a very nasty, nasty thing to say. But I think it also is helpful to remind folks about what they're up against in that country too.
I mean, it's the most sort of poetic evocation of what reaction looks like from somebody who has seen it from one of the highest levels of trying to, like, frankly, liberate people. That, there's going to be a class of people who really resent that, which is grim. And, what's so interesting about this now is you have people who are frankly to the right of left of center, but to the right of where Lula would be, who, like, are skeptical of, say, Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, but understand, one, Bolsonaro is very bad because, yes, he is and was. And two, the Amazon is significantly important to us as, like, a global community. And that tension is very interesting to watch.
Mm-hmm. And I've said this before, and I know Matt's probably tired of hearing me saying that, but, like, it's also important to be careful about how we talk about that, because it absolutely is true that the Amazon is of critical importance to the global ecosystem. But it really does piss me off the way that you even hear some liberals who might be supporting Lula doing it solely for the fate of the Amazon. So again, I'm not saying that it's not an important issue. I'm not saying that it's not worth caring about to encourage people to support Lula. But it sort of is like, well, you should have some thought also about, like, the lives of the millions of people who live in Brazil too.
And what's so great about Lula is he, like we talk about Bernie Sanders, about the conciseness of the messaging. When Lula gets clipped by, like, Channel 4 News in the UK, the things he's are saying, like, we need to show that we can build prosperity and protect the rainforest. Like, those things are hand in hand. And that's really, like, fundamentally the like, can he do that both? Because, like, there are, I think, very powerful interests that don't want that lesson to be proven, especially, like, the folks who want to just extract everything.
So just jumping back into the history a little bit, though. So Lula was able to push forward all of these incredible reforms that, again, like, these are not small things. This is like world historic changes in people's, like, lived reality, their experience, the food that they have, their nutrition, basic shit. Lula was able to push through all these reforms, oftentimes with very hostile Congresses, right? With the right wing or, like, the center right in power. And Lula was able to do this because he had the incredible ability to be able to leverage the social movements in the country without waiting, as you hear in the United States all the time. Well, Biden can't do anything because Biden's waiting for, super majorities in Congress. Lula was able to do that in incredible hostility in a country that has, in recent memory, a history of military dictatorship. So I'm just going to say I have very little time for excuses on that front. Lula knew the moment that he was in. Lula knew the conditions that he was in and was able to provide incredible amounts of things for people. The right came back with a vengeance, first deposing Dilma Rousseff, who I think it's also important that people in the American left familiarize themselves with, because she too was taken down for very spurious, nonsensical reasons and was replaced with a right-wing dinosaur, Temer, who imposed harsh austerity on the country of Brazil. And when Lula was primed to retake power, the right and the rich and the United States imposed a system of lawfare. Right? Some people might not know what that word means, but it means, like, using the legal system to promote, like, legal warfare against an opponent. And this move was supported clandestinely by the United States government, which was sought to destroy Lula and that movement. And they promoted nonsensical corruption charges against him. And that led to Lula being barred from running, and he was later imprisoned. And then after that, Haddad, who was sort of picked to replace Lula when Lula was going to be in prison and was barred from running for president, lost to Bolsonaro, which ushered in all of this devastation for working class Brazilians, indigenous people, and the environment. And I just want to say right up top, our friend Michael would not let this story disappear in the United States. And, as I said earlier, now you even have kind of like softer Democrats pushing for more investigation into the U.S. role. And before we get back to Lula, I do just want to, since this is the opportunity to remember maybe some old wounds, there were a lot of critics of what Michael was saying about Lula, and he was 100% vindicated. Now, those people all now support Lula and act as if they didn't have questions. But when Michael said, no, the corruption charges against Lula are spurious and erroneous, people were like, well, I don't know. Maybe he is corrupt. He's been president for a long time. And they were playing into that same game that the right wing was pushing. And I just want to, shout out Michael for having the courage and the research ability and having a long view of history to recognize that all this shit was not going to last. And it's also a good reminder as, we do things going forward, me and Matt and other folks, that, a lot of people will jump on the bandwagons of things. And that's why these kind of right-wing, stories can be so damaging. Like I remember when Evo Morales was being challenged by a nonsensical charge of, stealing the election in Bolivia. You had a lot of people on the quote unquote left in the United States and abroad, hedging their bets, playing both sides, not being able to take a firm stance on this kind of thing. And I don't know, it's worth remembering. If you, as much as Matt and I are remembering this moment, in a great way of like one success for the Brazilian people and also a really great vindication for Michael Brooks. Also remember that there were a lot of detractors when all this was going on.
Yeah, fact.
But let's before we go any further, let's get to the man himself. I'm sure many people have seen this before, but this is the perfect time to play it. This is Lula right before he surrendered himself to be falsely imprisoned for the nonsensical charges in Lava Jato. Speaking the way that Lula speaks.
Não adiantam tentar evitar que eu ande por esse país, porque tem milhões e milhões de Lula, de Bolo, de Manuela, de Dilma Rousseff para andar por mim. Não adianta tentar acabar, sabe, com as minhas ideias. Elas já estão pairando no ar e não tem como prendê-las. Não adianta tentar parar o meu sonho, porque quando eu parar de sonhar, eu sonharei pela cabeça de vocês e pelos donos de vocês. Não adianta achar que tudo vai parar o dia que o Lula tiver infarte. É bobagem, porque o meu coração baterá pelo coração de vocês. E são milhões de corações. Os poderosos podem matar uma, duas ou três rosas, mas jamais conseguirão deter a chegada da primavera, e a nossa luta é em busca da primavera.
Yeah. I mean, I remember playing that out of it's so good, man. It's like the man knows how to rise to a moment for sure. And like, he had incredible courage, not running. There's a lot of people who are, trying to say he should leave the country instead of being in prison because they were understandably afraid of what the right wing was going to be doing under Bolsonaro. But Lula has that kind of courage that, not many of us are born with to refuse that advice.
I mean, and faith in the people, I feel like that, the only way you have faith in the justice system gonna come down on the right side of that thing is if you think the people are gonna overwhelm them when the facts come to light. And that's what Lula called the bluff, said, fine, I'll go to fucking jail. I'm gonna fight this shit. And I mean, yeah, that it's a pretty astounding Like that part. That's why like this almost feels like a cherry on top. Is like sort of like the highs of him beating that crap. And then, you know, like this is just sort of like it's like the Western Conference Finals were like the real challenging one, and then like the NBA Finals are sort of like, you know, you're done in 5 games.
I'm just gonna read this right quick for y'all because we're gonna talk about the right wing in this country in a little bit. But I hear these kind of whiny, snot-nosed neoliberal characters still wanting to play this game about Lula maybe actually being corrupt, even though it has been completely repudiated at this point. Yeah, I mean, sorry, like these people. This is not the focus of the clip, so I don't want to get worked up about it. But like these people always act like they have facts and reason and logic by their side. They don't read shit. They just think that whatever like the lefty position on something is like the ill-informed one, when what they're spouting, especially in this case, is absolute nonsense.
I mean, corruption, I'm sorry, like, and this is like maybe not the most, like, this is just being real, and this is not being politic. Corruption is something, it's like a 5th level fucking concern, honestly. The first concerns is who's getting fed. And if the right people are getting fed, then you know what? It's a little, you look a bit past it. And this is not to say like Lula was, all that shit was bullshit, but I'm just saying like even bullshit. If, right? And if you look at the history of corruption politics going back to our country, which is like, when do we start getting obsessed with corruption politics? It's right after we enfranchise black people, right? And it's like, oh, we really look at the way all this patronage is like, yeah, you should have told that to fucking Andrew Jackson, right? Like you didn't have complaints back then, but now all of a sudden we're really wringing our hands about like, ooh, this and that. And it's like, generally you have to be like, we just know that is weaponized by reaction. That's just a fundamental fact. We can all want to fight corruption, and that is a great goal, and bureaucracies like engender that. You have to be real about like what's going on the actual fucking playing field.
Well, and like again, I said, since we'll do it now. You know, I think it's worthwhile remembering that in Brazil, like they don't have the same kind of system of legalized corruption that we do in the United States, right? Where like corporations could just donate millions of dollars legally to candidates. They have a system where there is a decent amount of grift because it just hasn't been legalized and formalized in the same way that it has in the modern day United States. I say all that, you know, just for one, people to understand the context, and two, the second point is that Lula has been completely cleared of all these things. All the investigations have come out and shown that it's completely erroneous. Just the most quick version of this for folks is that there were worries about the dealings of Petrobras, which is the state-run oil company. And where is Lula involved in this? The only thing that they could claim against Lula, which ended up not being true at all, was that Lula had a condo in a beach town. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, and I will admit I've never been to Brazil, so I don't want to attack any town or anything like that. But from what I've been told about by friends in Brazil, it's not even really like the nice beach town, right? It's actually like a very adorable one. It'd be like having a condo in Myrtle Beach or something like that versus like Miami. But anyways, not even true. Lula didn't own the apartment, etc. He's been completely cleared on this. And again, if you don't want to take my word on it, right? You think, you know, I'm just ideological leftist. Here is the word of the United Nations Human Rights Council. While states have a duty to investigate and prosecute acts of corruption and to keep the population informed, especially when a former head of state is concerned, such actions must be conducted fairly and respect due process guaranteed, said committee member Arif Bolkan. The Supreme Federal Court quashed Lula's sentence in 2021, ruling that former Judge Sergio Moro, who had overseen the initial corruption trial, had no jurisdiction to investigate and try cases, and annulled the investigation on the basis that the former judge was not considered to be impartial. Going back to a quote, although the Supreme Federal Court vacated Lula's conviction and imprisonment in 2021, after he had already been imprisoned, this is my addition to that, after he had already been imprisoned, already pulled out of the election. Going back to the quote, these decisions were not timely and effective enough to avoid or redress the violations. Going back to the article released from the United Nations. The committee found that the conduct and other public acts of former Judge Moro violated Lula's rights to be tried by an impartial tribunal, and that the actions and public statements by the former judge and the prosecutors were also a violation of his rights to his presumption of innocence. These procedural violations rendered Lula's prohibition to run for president arbitrary, the committee ruled, and therefore in violation of his political rights, including his right to run for office. So again, you don't have to take it from me. This is the United Nations saying this at this point, right? The facts are very clear here. Lula has been vindicated, and his imprisonment was a farce of law and order. It was all about Sergio Moro trying to pursue a political career, and it was supported by the United States because they did not like the fact that Lula was, one, under Obama, more popular than Obama, and two, was somebody who would regularly stand up to American imperial ambitions across the globe. Sergio Moro, I think for Brazilians who are listening to this, they already know who he is. This is somebody who is the epitome of a careerist, somebody who threw the country of Brazil under the bus in order to further his own political ambitions. And Bolsonaro was the beneficiary of all this. Now, this is my perspective on this. I think that the capitalists and the rich and the powerful in Brazil did not intend for Bolsonaro to be the person who benefited from Lula's imprisonment, but they were very happy for Bolsonaro to beat Lula. I mean, to beat.
I mean, this is the classic elite conservative fascist trade-off, right? Like, you got to have the base turnout in elections, in nominally democratic elections, and you can't say no to these guys.
Yep. So that's how we got to. Yeah, sorry.
One note, just to double back on the corruption thing, and again, you're right to keep underlining the Lula proved innocent, and like there's no there's the presumption of innocence is not afforded him. But I just like to put it into context of like, this is Rex Tillerson's fucking house, like
yeah,
like right, like in North Texas, like. And that's just like, that's good. He deserves that. And it's just like, I just got to say, like, if we nationalize, if a politician isn't like, if we nationalize these oil industries, let's say Chris Murphy does that. Chris Murphy can have a little beach house, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway,
but again, I know I do appreciate your take, but it's just like, it's not the same. I don't know if I have any pictures of the interior, but let me just share this really quick with y'all, just if we're doing that, just so people understand also what we are talking about. I didn't prep it, so I don't have any pictures of the interior. But like, this is like the level, like a condo in a building like this. Again, not trying to demean anybody's place of living or anything like that. But
I'd love to live in that.
One, it's like the corrupt, what was alleged against him was not true, and two, it's like, honestly, it's like a little adorable if that's like the spoils, right? I hear you.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So that's how we got here, and I think it's worthwhile bringing all that back up. But here's what happened in the first round of the election. And Brazil has a system where they have the first round where they have a lot of different candidates running, and then if one candidate gets 50% plus, then they win outright. If not, it's 1 and 2, person who came first and the person who came second in a runoff election. And in the first round, we all hoped Lula would walk away with it in the first round. And in fairness, this was a very ambitious hope. And when we had Brian Muir of Brazil Wire on the program, he made this point a lot, which I think was important. People, because we had extremely high hopes that might have not really been in line with the polling, with the situation, buried the fact that Lula won a significant majority of votes in the first round. Just not enough to cross the 50% threshold. And in the second election and the second round, Lula won, as I said a minute ago. He got 60 million plus votes to Bolsonaro's 58 million plus votes. So Lula, while it was within a percentage point, right, 1% basically, Lula won this one by a significant amount of the population. There's question. I mean, there's worries about what this dynamic means for the future of Brazil. Right. But the fact is, this was an incredible victory. And I think a lot of people who were so excited about a first round victory might have not have helped out too much by sort of being extremely pessimistic. But before we get to Bolsonaro and the aftermath stuff, I do just want to remind some folks, because I'm sad is the wrong word, Matt. But it's just like, I just had this realization that hopefully this is the last time we're going to have to talk about Jair Bolsonaro on Left Reckoning, except as like a cautionary tale of the past. So there are so many things that we could talk about regarding him. I mean, this person is a far right fella. He has stoked incredible murderous violence. Like, people have died in Brazil under Bolsonaro's presidency, not just because of his horrible economic policies, which have led people into starvation, but because of the feeling that you could get away with political violence in the country. We'll start first with the Amazon. The National Space Research Agency, INPE, registered 31,000 fire alerts in the Amazon via satellite in the first 30 days of August this year, making it the worst August since 2010, when fires totaled 45,000 a month. And a lot of this has to do with policy in Brazil, but a hell of a lot of it has to do with the fact that Bolsonaro was encouraging people to break environmental regulations, because they saw Bolsonaro flaunt the law, ignore the law, and he was basically saying, do whatever you want. So people were ignoring on the books laws in Brazil about forest management and not being able to burn in certain places, etc. So you had a lot of land grabs from landed aristocracy in Brazil. So much for the whole law and order thing that Bolsonaro was supposed to be running, supposed to be president for. And it's gotten so bad in the Amazon that there have been warnings that in the next 5 years, the rainforest in the Amazon will not hold enough moisture to remain a rainforest and might very likely become a savanna. So it's definitely critical that Lula is president on that environmental level. But I think it's, again, as we said earlier, I get annoyed when people can only talk about trees and not people. The food situation has been horrific in the country under Bolsonaro's run. Around 33 million people in Brazil are living in hunger, up from 19 million in 2020. This is from the Brazilian Network for Research on Food Security. 15.5% of households in the country are struggling when it comes to food. More than half of the country, 125.2 million people, suffer from food insecurity of some kind, which is a massive increase of 7.2% from 2020. And remember, folks, that when we talk about Lula's legacy, one of his most important legacies was the fact that he eradicated, or pushed down dramatically, at least, hunger in the country of Brazil. And you saw that creep back up under Bolsonaro and under Michel Temer, which is also an important thing to remember, that not only is this an important election because Lula was elected, but if you think about it, for Brazilians, the last two people who have sat in the office of the president of Brazil were brought into power through illegitimate means. If it was Michel Temer, who came in because of the lawfare and the bullshit attacks against Dilma Rousseff, or if it was Bolsonaro, who came into power because of the nonsensical Lava Jato attacks against him. We're going to get back into Bolsonaro and some of the reasons that he's a shitty dude in just a second. But I got to play this clip because I feel like, if anything, this represents Lula very well. And if I can be a little selfish, I think it represents maybe some form of socialism that Matt and I are trying to push. We can maybe call this, if we call some of the things here honky-tonk socialism, this is barbecue socialism. Here's Lula talking to a crowd, and this is an hour-long speech. He talks about a lot of other issues, but I love this so much from Lula, both politically and philosophically. I'll just play it, and then we could talk about it. This is Lula, I think in September of this year.
Nós vamos voltar a ter o direito de, no final de semana, fazer churrasquinho em família, de comprar uma picanhazinha e aquele pedacinho de picanha com gordura passado na farinha e copo de cerveja gelado. É tudo que o povo precisa e é tudo que o povo tem direito. E é isso que a gente vai brigar para garantir para vocês.
Fuck yeah, man. I mean, that's a perfect. I mean, I like this for a lot of reasons, right? One, because I mean, people probably know the quote, like, we want bread, but we want roses too, right? That's something that us in the DSA quote a lot, but like, it's demanding more. Lula here is not just saying we're going to have, basic food stuffs for people. He's like, I want a nice cut of meat for you on Saturday and a nice cold beer. Like, you deserve, working people deserve not only subsistence, but like something to look forward to, something that makes life joyful. And I'll also say that when he presents that, that's a man who eats and a man who drinks too. Like, that's not some kind of like canned Mitt Romney, like, I like hot dogs. Like, that's a guy who appreciates Brazilian barbecue and cooking as well. You're muted, Matt. Apologies.
When you put it like that, when he puts it like that, and so positive a sort of message from a politician, it makes you look at all the messages in culture that are like questioning like people's eating choices. I mean, the avocado toast is the famous one, but like the way SNAP benefits are fucking restricted, so people can't get a hot sandwich and instead have to get cold cuts at a fucking bodega. It's sickening. It's
Dude, I
like,
mean,
and it's very real, and it's fucking sick.
I grew up on food stamps, and I remember having to get the cold chickens. If my family, rotisserie chickens are like a part of, I think, most Americans' diet. And, there's a little bit of humiliation being like, oh, at Walmart, they're going to put the chickens for the poor cold. They cool them down before you can buy them because you couldn't get it if it was, if it was warm. And
that's
something,
a message.
it's
That's a
100%
message
a
being
message.
sent.
And that's what I love about Lula. Like, I really like, like, you can make criticism of Lula. Like, could he be like this radical communist guy? Right. Whatever. I'm happy to have like a reason, like a good conversation with somebody about that.
Among leftists, yeah.
But a lot of that is like, I think it's like fanciful bullshit. You're not talking politics. Right. You're just talking aesthetics. Comparing Lula to like the American liberal tradition in this country, Lula is not somebody who's saying we're going to give people subsistence. He's saying we're going to give people a better life than they have today, with all of the benefits. Not just you're going to have a better life because you're going to have some food. Yeah, you can enjoy things, and we want you to enjoy things. That is why I'm running. That is what we are fighting. He literally says this is what we are fighting for. Now, again, just so people don't, make this like too much of a caricature, Lula talks about all of these other critical things for Brazilian people. But like, he says that right at the end of the clip. This is what we are fighting for. This is like the hope. This is like the embodiment of the movement that we are building. And I think that's a really, really important thing for us on the socialist left in the United States to uphold, is that we're not just fighting to like prevent atrocities. We're not just fighting to prevent starvation and pain. We are fighting to end those things, but we're actually fighting for your life to be much better than it is today. And Lula is somebody who I think is unafraid of taking that position. Well, I'm sure Matt and I were spending a little time before the show figuring out how we want to do this, because we have some serious analysis about what's next. But I saw this the other day, and I feel like Michael would have I'm not going to be able to joke about this as good as he would, but I saw this and I thought it was the funniest fucking thing. And I wanted to share this because Bolsonaro has basically been on a sad tour. He's hidden away from the media for the most part. He came out today and he didn't concede, but his lackeys and many of the major, not many, but like a significant amount of like the Bolsonaro supporters have accepted the results. And he's basically said that he'll accept the transition. And we'll talk more about potential worries in the next couple of months in a second. But before that, let's just have a little bit of fun, because this really cracked me the fuck up. And I think no better place for this to come from than the Daily Mail. Jair Bolsonaro and his wife unfollow each other on Instagram amid rumors they have split as Brazil still waits the political strongman to concede elections. And
right. Now, before you turn what is Michelle Bolsonaro into some sort of like project sort of like heroic politics on her, like people kind of did with Melania. she was photographed on election day, proudly casting her ballot in a giant Israeli flag T-shirt.
Yeah.
So like that's the type of woman we're dealing with here. But continue with this
No,
gossip.
I mean, there's not much more else you can say about this. I mean, a great example of like a true cuck, Jair Bolsonaro, just seeing his life
Look,
explode, and rightfully so.
I mean, it'd be easier if I was like Sam Zeder divorced, so I could speak on this. But like, there's a strong divorced guy attacking the world quotient going on with between Kanye, between Elon, between Bolsonaro. Like divorce guys. I mean, I'm surprised
guys are causing trouble.
I'm surprised Trump's not a divorced guy yet. Jeff Bezos, a divorced guy. Bill Gates, a divorced guy. Divorced guys.
Yeah, I mean, we all go through it sometimes, Matt. But
we have good divorce guys. Hey, we can unify the good divorce guys for good on our side. We just need to get out there and have somebody speak for them.
So, I mean, like, let's talk about some of the scary things that happen. What's in front of us? And, Matt, I think you have something from the States to maybe cue us up on this.
Yeah, so I didn't. Well, wasn't familiar with the New York Young Republican Club. That's not entirely true. I feel like occasionally they come up on my radar every once in a while. But they had a tweet recently, and it's a quote tweet of the leader of the New York Young Republicans, Gavin Mario Wax. I think that's his real name. Bolsonaro should not repeat the mistake of Trump. Fight back against any fraud and a stolen election. And then the New York Young Republicans tweet that saying, it's time for action, send in the tanks. Now, the tweet got deleted in a way that kind of annoys me. It broke Twitter's service, and it's just like, I want that stuff up until they delete it themselves, because I think it's useful to be able to point to, like, look at these nerds pretending like there's some sort of like, I don't know, Pinochet from New York. But yeah, pretty pathetic stuff.
No, totally. And like, the threats of a coup from Bolsonaro were not, invented. This is somebody who said that this is somebody who said that he wouldn't leave the office unless God took him, or he was killed, or he's victorious, right?
And his people were like pulling guns on folks.
Yeah, one of the psycho Congress people who's been elected pulled a gun out on I'm assuming a Lula supporter, and threatened them, and has flaunted the law. Now, I think there's a lot more wrong with pulling a gun out on somebody than this, but Brazilian gun law, which I'll admit I'm not an expert on.
I imagine it's a little bit like ours.
You're not allowed to carry on election day or the day before election day. Wow. So she broke the gun law by doing that, and has flaunted it, saying that she doesn't recognize the authority of the Supreme Court to make that.
Yeah, law and order.
Yeah. Again, the party of law and order. And like, it's funny, but this is scary. I mean, this is a country where we have seen political assassinations. We've seen really brutal murders of like important leftist figures in that country in recent memory.
Marielle Franco.
Yes. And like, so, it's funny, but like, so I'm not judging anyone for laughing at it. I'm laughing at it myself. But like, these kind of threats and moments are very frightening, and they should be to folks. But that's what Bolsonaro has cultivated in Brazil. And the one major election story that we haven't really covered in depth yet was something that happened with the police in the country. And there's a lot of articles on this, but I think this, for our American audience, from Branco, who just always endorse reading Branco March to Teach on anything that he writes about, wrote, Brazil's election shows the dangers of an increasingly far-right police. And let me get right here. So the celebrations over the victory of left-wing challenger Lula last night were preceded by alarm that Brazil's federal highway police were trying to steal the election from him. Reports of traffic jams and massive delays caused by police checkpoints on election day sparked fears of voter suppression, particularly since they were taking place overwhelmingly in Brazil's northeast, a pro-Lula stronghold. According to police memo obtained by the Brazilian report, searches of vehicles shot up by 80% on the day of the runoff compared to the general election at the start of October. So Bolsonaro, and like the thing here, so let me just lay this out before we get to Rusty Bronco's argument. The thing here is, again, for people who don't know what happened here, was that you had the highway police stopping buses and vehicles and inspecting them, checking the tires, doing all this kind of stuff in the name of public safety that just so happened to happen on election day, right? Delaying people significantly. Now, the Brazilian Electoral Commission ordered them to stop, and the Brazilian Electoral Commission said there's no way that this could have affected voting, which very, early.
Oh, I'll take your word for it. Yeah, sure.
Very early to be able to say that this didn't affect anybody for being able to vote. And when you look at how close the final vote total ended up being, a very, very significant action. And yeah, as we noted there, 80% increase in vehicles stopped by the police. And the police in Brazil, much like the United States, are populated mainly by far-right lunatics. Whether or not this came from Bolsonaro, we can't really speculate. But it doesn't matter, right? Because this is the kind of thing that he encouraged.
He said, exactly. He set the conditions for it. It's like, won't someone rid me of this meddlesome priest? Fucking Henry VIII type stuff. Like, they know what their job is, and when he's starting to talk about election fraud, those guys are going to be on alert.
But I will just take my host privilege and say that I think it's very, very likely that there was coordination on this. It was brazen. I mean, this is really brazen to do something like this. I mean, apart from the fact that you're delaying people from showing up to the vote, what is this? It's a man showing up to you with a gun and delaying you from being able to partake in your constitutional right to elect your leader, right? This is like hyper reactionary. This is fascism, like to a T. Luckily, Lula wins. This is not the story. If it was flipped, it could have been really, really damaging and worrying. The fact is that Bolsonaro, there's no doubt about it in my brain, wanted for there to be some kind of coup attempt. I think that because of his incompetence, because of the damage that he's done, the military certainly wants to wage war against Lula, but did not see Bolsonaro as maybe the most viable way to do that. So we're not out of the woods yet. And people should read the piece in Jacobin. Brazil's election shows the dangers of an increasingly far-right police. And they make some very, I think, astute warnings to Americans because we're living under similar dynamics here. But, so Lula wins. What is this going to mean going forward? Bolsonaro has devastated the country. He devastated it through his war on working class people. He devastated it through budget cuts. He's devastated through his war on the environment. And I think for people who don't know Brazil, they should understand that the budget that is set is the budget for next year. Bolsonaro set the budget for next year. Lula can push back against this through presidential decrees, etc. But it's going to take a concerted effort for him to basically be able to undo the damage of Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro poisoned the well, right? For lack of a better metaphor, before leaving office. And who knows what will happen over the next couple of months. I don't want to be too confident in saying that there won't be any shenanigans going on over the next couple of months. It looks like his ability to maybe like pull back the results of the elections might be limited, but that doesn't prevent him, for example, from just like outright saying we're not going to respect the election. So we have to be watching Brazil very, very closely over the next few months. It's been encouraging. I think the international recognition so far of Lula. But again, we're not out of the woods yet in Brazil.
I mean, one thing that's ongoing with Brazil, I want to share this video. Fern Carago, a DSA member, tweeted, Bolsonaro's supporters celebrating news of arrest of Alexandre de Moraes, minister of the Brazilian Supreme Court, for supposedly fraud in the elections that benefited Lula. And, we'll just watch these folks, that's new. This is late breaking news. Arrested this guy, and we'll watch these folks, these Bolsonaro folks celebrating this. And as we watch them celebrate, they're celebrating did not happen. That's a
Can't
it's
hear
a
you,
lie.
man. Say that again. No, we can hear you now. We just couldn't hear you the first time.
They are celebrating something that did not happen. This guy was not arrested. There was not election fraud, but yet Bolsonaro supporters taken to the streets here in Sao Paulo to celebrate the arrest of this guy. And it's fascinating. Like, I think there is a lot to say about, like, you know, this new Ken Klippenstein, Li Fong report about, you know, misinformation and how the state is going to be responding to that sort of thing. Nonetheless, like, it is a fucking real phenomenon that gets people like acting.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean he has a lot of power, and like again, we can't deny the fact that nearly 50%, 49% of Brazilians voted for Bolsonaro. You can talk about how committed some of those people are to his movement. Let's just assume that it's like not super deep. 20%, that's worrying. There's always been that in Brazilian politics, but it's there, and this movement, particularly in some of the victories you saw in the congressional and statewide elections in Brazil, there's going to be a lot of pushback. So there's the far right that's been mobilized. What's going to be the reaction of the rich? I think we're still going to have to watch that play out. I think Lula has shown an ability to be able to placate those factors, and we're going to talk more about the kind of theory behind that with Kuba in just a second. Financial Times stuff has been pretty funny so far. Not necessarily outright condemning, because they didn't really like Bolsonaro for his antics, but a lot of worries. But let's just take it a little closer to the United States here. We have former member of the Marxist Spartacist League in the United States. I don't know if you knew that, Matt. Jim.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Jim Cramer, and let's just hear what Jim Cramer has to say about Brazil.
Who likes the stock very much. Jacob in North Carolina. Jacob.
Jimmy Chill, booyah.
Booyah, what's going on?
He looks so bad, man.
Hey, I just want to ask you about this stock because it doesn't look too good. I'm really bearish on it. It's got exposure to e-commerce, emerging markets. I feel like there's pull forward, but I'm not sure how the Brazilian election comes in. I'm looking to take a chunk out of Mercado Libre's market cap.
I think it's a sale because I don't like the way politics are shaping up in Latin America. They seem to have gone all the way back to the days when people are going to be, let's just say, where the middle class gets in trouble. And the upper class, no, but the middle class. And therefore, I think let's stay concerned. Let's stay away from Mercado Libre. And I was an original investor in the company. Let's go.
Excuse me. Yeah, so that's Kramer. I mean, if we're doing a sorry, man, I keep on cutting you off. I'm not going to do a gem because we're running a little over, but there hasn't been like the full sell-off that we usually see when the left wing wins. But that doesn't mean that financial markets aren't sort of priming themselves to take a very strong anti-Lula position going forward. But that's the view from an asshole who makes a lot of money giving people bad stock tips and trying to push people in a certain direction.
It's funny how he seemed to, like, the way he said that, like, let's just say it's like the way he put it, the middle class is going to get hurt, but not so much the upper class. Like, what the fuck is he, like, what is that?
Yeah, that's Americanisms being projected into Brazilian politics. It's a lie in this country, but it's even more one there. Before we jump over, and we're going to do, we'll definitely have a guest on soon to do a little bit more in depth, but we want to make sure we were celebrating it this week. I did want to direct people to this article that was published in Brazil Wire by Alex Fleck, who is somebody that we're big fans of and would love to get on the program sometime soon, entitled, "What Can the Western Left Learn from Lula's Breathtaking Victory?" And he goes through some of the struggles that Lula went up against. I really like this bit here because if you read the first bit, and Alex, if you're watching or anything, don't take this as a critique. You get almost like what the excuses would be, right, if Lula were to lose, right? And he says, in addition, Bolsonaro was helped by his campaign on social media platforms, Brazil's election, finance laws, and personal cash donations by wealthy allies. According to researchers at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, YouTube's algorithm overwhelmingly recommended pro-Bolsonaro content to users, especially Joven Pan, 55% of first recommendations, a major media ally to Bolsonaro. It seems like YouTube's new algorithmic content policy that seeks to recommend content that is informative, plural, and from reputable sources may have even labeled it as a mainstream media outlet. And then he goes on to note that Lula doesn't even care phone, which I find very adorable. I'll bring that up just to say, because I remember when I was still living in New York, seeing Haddad, who, this is not me coming at him or anything like that, but he was on a panel with Yanis Varoufakis talking about the rise of the right and the loss in Brazil. And Haddad complained about fake news and social media. There's no doubt about it that these are problems. But Varoufakis said something I think that was very true. It's like, well, we got to beat them. Like, we have like the ability with the people and as leftists to find ways to beat these folks. And we can't just sit on our laurels. Yes, sometimes they have those advantages, but we have to be able to beat them. Anyways, I like this piece a lot for that. But more importantly, getting to some of the lessons from Lula's win. He's this. Furthermore, Lula is a real moderate, not in the United States centrist Democrat or Blairite type, but a real one with negotiating abilities honed from decades in the union movement. He uses these abilities to leverage his powers and reach compromises with both sides of his coalition. PT did not simply co-sign the pro-business side's politics or focus group their way into a platform. They combined policies and campaign strategies coming from the actual left and the center right. Lula's abilities, his political talent extends his ability to foresee political dynamics and tendencies. He knew that Bolsonaro would throw the kitchen sink at him, and he did. Bolsonaro did everything he could, broke every imaginable law. Lula foresaw that if he was really going to beat Bolsonaro, he needed to compete for every single possible vote, and that demanded the broadest of coalitions without compromising democratic values. And we're looking at the results now, and it was successful. I mean, you know, a lot of times when people are talking about Brazil, they bring up the new powerful strength of the evangelical movement in that country. Lula recognized this and spoke to them. He started quoting the Bible in a left way to speak to that kind of shared tradition. Like, he didn't eschew them. He recognized the opportunities there. And I think that's a very powerful lesson. Anyway, there's a lot more nuggets of wisdom in this piece. Check it out on Brazil Wire, which you should already be reading regularly. What can the Western left learn from Lula's breathtaking victory? But there's a hell of a lot we can learn from this. I think for now, it's very fair to be able to take a moment and celebrate and cheers again. I might have finished my beer, but I will cheers again.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you want to add before we bring Kuba on?
No, I you know, it's nice, and I appreciated all the folks who thought of Michael and brought up that interview, which, you know, David and I are still a little bit salty. Didn't do the numbers that
go watch it.
Wanted it to, but yeah, you can still watch it now.
And I'll just say, you know, in addition to like the gratitude and the debt and, you know, deep feelings for Michael and all of his work, like, if I could just take a moment, like, I've been very blessed through these past few years to be able to meet a lot of really wonderful people in Brazil, you know, from Brian to people like Victor. So I'm very thankful for those relationships, and I'm excited to bring folks on from Brazil to talk about good shit that Lula's doing instead of the disasters of Bolsonaro's presidency.
Man, yeah, it's wild. It's the future, finally.
Finally. But folks, don't forget, after Kuba, we're going to be jumping over the post game. We'll be taking your calls. You can leave us a voicemail, and I'll queue those up at 1-940-289-7234. You can get access to the post game and all the extra bonus content at patreon.com/leftreckoning. We've got a lot of really great stuff up there. I mean, deep stuff. I mean, you really get 2 to 1 content on the Patreon, because we do the post game and then we do a bonus episode every Sunday. So please consider supporting the show there. But
and
shows
if you want to hear the live show, right? We posted that audio.
Yeah, live shows up, and that was so much fun. Hopefully, we'll be able to do more in the future. But yeah, join us in the post game, and until then, let's jump over to Kuba.
Peace. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, is David Griscom. Hello, David.
What's up, brother?
Not much, except right now we are joined by Deep State Kuba himself. You might know him from the This Is Revolution podcast. David and I recently met Kuba at the Los Angeles live show, where I think it's unanimously agreed that he stole the show.
I appropriated the show.
They settled and colonized the show. Kuba, how about Deep State Kuba? Introduce folks. How did you get from the Deep State to the what's the podcast? Is that like the Ninth Estate? The like streamers.
Yeah, it's the limbo of American politics, where anything goes but nothing matters. And to just give a little short background on me, I'm a Canadian, born in Poland, but we came over. My mom likes to say that she saved me from Polish communism, and then TIR sucked me back into the left. And I grew up in interior British Columbia, but I got accepted to Harvard, and that was my entry point into the rarefied world of the American elite through a Harvard connection. As I was doing my PhD at Berkeley, I became low-level assistant, travel arranger, coffee cake buyer type program guy for a U.S. Department of Defense initiative to partner with Iraqi tribal leaders to deliver non-sensitive goods to U.S. bases across Iraq. That was how I came into the deep state world. And later, I came to Washington and worked on Department of Defense projects, doing geopolitical and economic risk analysis, some organizational studies for the Air Force. I briefed generals at the Pentagon. I preferred to arrive by scooter because I like littering the Pentagon parking lot with like all the little devices. They shut them down, actually. There's a kill area around the kind of inner parking lot. So you just see piles and piles of dead scooters. And then I had some exposure to the think tank world. My politics have always been on the left socialist stock dem spectrum, but I didn't really have a vehicle or an entry point there. It was actually easier to join the deep state than to, because I like to say that the Comintern wasn't hiring and the online left wasn't a thing yet. So I worked for a while in that kind of think tank, defense contractor, DoD world. I got fired in 2020, came back to Canada, and I'm now continuing to do government contracting, but in more innocuous ways. Or is that my cover story?
I want to come back to the Harvard, because I've always been curious. I went to NYU, but as a grad student, so I wasn't on campus and didn't really see any recruitment or like a culture. But these Ivy Leagues is where a lot of these sorts of folks are recruited from. Can you talk about, like, did you see that at Harvard? Like, what's that like as like a day-to-day part of, like, people just have like this idea, like, this is a career I'm going to go into?
So Harvard and the Ivy Leagues in general are not really incubators for the deep state. Not anymore. There was a time when Yale and Princeton were contributing entire offices, entire bureaus for the CIA, clandestine services, the State Department. But when I was there, yeah, exactly. And the Dulles brothers, right? Or
yeah.
And when I was there, the most desirable track that undergraduates were shunted towards was high finance, actually. The most prestigious job you could get was at Goldman Sachs, then other Wall Street firms, then management consulting. If you were an irredeemable nerd, maybe you went into STEM or academia or medicine, a lot of law school. But especially as the first step out of college, government service, and I think this is true broadly speaking, was so devalued that it was seen as a bit of a fallback position at best, right? There were people who were looking in that direction, but generally you went into law school and then graduate school in order to get regional specialization, language skills, and then you'd pivot into sometimes regular government service, but more often different types of contracting at consulting companies like Dahlberg is one. Another one is DAI, which essentially privatized the USAID and certain Department of Defense, Department of State analytic functions. And you'd make a private sector salary, and it was a much more corporate type of experience than showing up to a government office building every day. There was interest on the part of government for people who had language skills, relevant regional experience, that kind of thing. Although there's a bureaucratic trade-off between the security risks, or more precisely, the bureaucratic challenge of vetting somebody who has a lot of connections overseas. You have to fill out a bio form for every close relationship that you have with a foreigner, even if it's just a professional relationship or they're going to vet that. And when it looked like I might be staying in DC, I had to fill out one of their clearance forms, and I needed something like 30 continuation pages just to fill out my foreign connections. Because we're talking about Canadians, Poles, Middle Easterners, Vietnamese. I had lived in many interesting places and had a very colorful life, and as a result, no way I'm getting a clearance. So you actually have Brigham Young as a major feeder into the FBI, State Department, CIA, because Mormons are considered to be incorruptible, but also they go on mission. They study languages. They're experienced in foreign countries. So that's a desirable group to get.
Well, and I'll also just say we talked to our buddies at the Brigham Young Money podcast about the type of opportunities, and it seemed to be in like direct sort of sales and multi-level marketing. So, they're looking for something to do. But I mean, that's interesting. If you wanted to continue, I didn't mean if I cut you off.
Also, the military is another major feeder. And what was common enough so that you stopped noticing it was mid-career officers, captains, majors sometimes, that would be studying at Harvard for a graduate degree. And they have deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan. They had that kind of experience, but now they were getting polished up they were basically doing their anthropology on American elite networks in order to be promotable and move up in the military hierarchy. So that's it's not what it's cracked up to be in terms of being like this incubator for that government elite. Harvard, the Ivy Leagues just love money. So they'll promote placement in whatever sector seems to be the leading, most dynamic economic, money machine. After I graduated, it was still finance for a few years, but now it's tech. If you get a job at Google, at Apple, or you're on a startup track of your own, then that's the job offer that you brag about. That's the one that, gets you dates. That's the one that gets you the envy of your classmates.
Right. So, I want to talk a little bit more about the civil diplomatic bureaucracy. And, you talk about going from Ivy League folks to now, Mormons and soldiers. Like, that's not necessarily an improvement. It's a difference. Like, can you just make the case? I think there's a lot of sort of reflexive distrust of civil diplomacy. What does it look like in the best case leftist scenario, and how far away from that are we in reality?
So I've met people with anti-systemic politics, let's call them, because they're not all leftists. Some of them are anarchists, actually, which is an even weirder thing to be if you're in the military-industrial complex. But it's not zero. And often, like me, you had a certain set of life experiences or a certain set of academic background, which made you an attractive candidate, and you didn't have better opportunities more aligned with your values. So often, one of my friends in DC, he couldn't get into a philosophy program at the University of Toronto, and it's like, okay, I guess I'm working for the Deep State now. And that's the fallback position. So you have people who think independently and critically within the system, but it's very isolated. And if that's your worldview, you're also at a professional disadvantage. You have to be careful about what you say, because there is a dominant hegemonic perspective within these organizations that you will fall out of immedially. And
you should call it cancel culture. Maybe we'll get somewhere. But
excellent, yeah, exactly. I'm just a Marxist-Leninist tanky that wants to destroy American imperialism through revolution, and I'm somehow being canceled out of the Defense Department. What about freedom of speech? What about my rights? And that hegemonic view, it basically just read anything that Brookings produces. Mm-hmm. There's a right wing and a left wing of it. AEI, Heritage, Cato, to a certain extent, represent the right wing, which is a little more nationalist, not necessarily more aggressive, but more on the weapons platforms and less on the humanitarian intervention side, and very preoccupied with the Washington Consensus and basically imposing neoliberalism as part of American foreign policy. The left side is all of that, but with more woke posturing. That's where you get the whole, I am a intersectional first generation Latina with generalized anxiety disorder, and I work for the CIA marketing. But the convergence is around American power is good. The enemies of America are evil. There is not just a right, but an obligation to intervene internationally. And we have to, we've created a rules-based international order that is being violated by Putin, by the People's Republic of China. And I like to say that in Washington, it's 1996 forever. There's still this idea about American powers being preeminent, the United States being the global agenda setter, and essentially the only limitation on what the United States can achieve is its will to commit to achieving it. That we could have had intersectional feminism and gay pride parades in Kandahar if we had just stayed 20 more years and we had just saw things through. So if you have difficulty accepting that, then generally speaking, at one point or another, you'll be purged by mid-career. I mean, it happened to me. Or you'll be shifted into less sensitive parts of the administrative apparatus. The think tank world is where you have ideology and strategy really being formed, and that's where plans and programs for missile defense or Ukraine policy or Iraqi reconstruction get produced. Elected officials might have strong opinions, but they get shaped, formed, and turned into policy through the think tank structure. And those think tanks survive on funder money and government contracts. The contract, one thing that I learned very quickly in Washington is the United States government doesn't do anything. It just issues contracts to do all the things that it's supposed to do. Whether it's intelligence collection and analysis, whether it's cybersecurity, there's always a private. The government can't do anything without a private company taking some profit. And as a result, when you look at figures of civil servants or federal employees, and Barack Obama liked to point out that under his watch, it was the first time that the federal workforce declined. It's entirely illusory, because the work is actually done by people who technically work for the private sector, but at organizations that have one client, which happens to be the federal government. And I mean, that's a feature, not a bug. It was deliberately designed this way. If you believe the official story, then it was in order to capture the dynamism and efficiencies of the private sector, which is, I can tell you, is not true, because they're neither dynamic nor efficient. But to prevent private sector unions from being able to control who becomes a cadre, and in order to bring in a capitalist bourgeois stratum into the operation and function of government.
So like on that, I mean, because I think we're getting somewhere interesting, and I will just note that like what you were saying about think tanks, I think is really true, and I think a lot of people, especially who haven't spent any time in DC, like don't recognize how much power they have. I went to college in DC, and like I interned at an Arabic language news organization, and one of my mentors there like really broke that down to me. It's like, all right, we're going to go to this think tank because they're the ones who are really going to start to influence this policy down the line. Anyway, that's a whole other thing we could get into in the future. But I wanted to ask you, because I think on our side, on the left, particularly like the socialist, Marxist left, I think there's an inheritance that we have, and I would call this more like pop Marxism than level it on Marx or Lenin themselves, of like thinking about the state, right? Where it's like the line is like, the state is just the central committee of the bourgeoisie, right? And it's not and I think that that's a little bit underdeveloped, and I'd be curious what you think about this, because it's not as if like capital doesn't have a lot of influence over the state, is not heavily involved in it, but the state does have its own interests, and more often than not, they're actually looking for like the long-term interests of capitalists, even if capitalists might be upset in the short term. But this is just me reading books and thinking about it. You've seen that world, and I would be curious if you sort of think that we should be developing more of an understanding on our side.
Well, I think that from the perspective of the socialist left, I'm more of a soc dem European style leftist, but essentially, if you're not part of the democratic hierarchy and the democratic machine, then there is fairly shallow understanding of how the state interacts with other power centers and what it can and cannot do, or what it can and cannot look like. So one thing that I very quickly point out is that the U.S. State structure is distinctive for the worse compared to other mature, developed Western democracies or East Asian states, even more so compared to Communist Party states, where you have a very clear demarcation that this is the private sector, but there is a government that oversees the private sector, that is above the private sector. This is where actual power resides, and that the interests of the state come ahead of mere business. And the term is state autonomy, that if you have that kind of government, then its decisions and its priorities are autonomous from the considerations of either any particular peak capitalists organization like a Google or an Apple, or capitalists as a whole. And this comes out of the fact that states ultimately are the ones who fight wars, and and state cadres are the ones who are at risk in case of invasion or revolution or other kinds of violent, sudden political change. Capitalists have a lot more wiggle room, especially if it's a war like, say, Ukraine versus Russia, where both sides are different flavors of, call it oligarchical capitalism. You could move across that divide relatively easily, but if you're actually working for Zelensky, if you're too closely tied with Putin, then your life is on the line. So it doesn't matter if the GDP is going to contract by 5%, or it doesn't matter if a couple of billionaires have to erase a zero from the end of their fortune. It's too important to leave it up to those considerations. Now, that's an extremis. In some of the more optimistic cases in Europe and Japan, then states might also function to mitigate some of the imbalances and contradictions and disruptions that are created by capitalism through things like a welfare state, through things like recognition of unions, or in Germany they call it trilateralism, where the state sits down with union leadership and corporate leadership to facilitate labor agreements and actually write in labor as part of their political economy, rather than treating it as this irritation that needs to be tamped down. Or environmental regulation, strong mandates around things like climate change, which might shutter entire industries. Now, that also requires state autonomy. And the people who fill, those kinds of states have a lot less contracting, much more of a professional civil service class, cradle to grave. You're going to be working for the government, or for the state or for the people, depending on the ideological character of the country. And there isn't the same revolving door. That the whole idea that you could work for, let's say, the FCC and then work for major telecom, that's just straight corruption in most of the world, right? It's simply illegal, and it's obviously illegal. And why would you ever let them do that? But in the United States, that line between private power and the power of the state is the blurriest that it gets, outside of some extraordinary cases like maybe Saudi Arabia, where it comes down to a family in charge. And the revolving door is where you have the power of the state to do anything with the private sector gets fatally diminished. And being a civil service career is something that's fanciful and old-fashioned in the US, but is actually a very high status life path in countries like France or Japan or Sweden. And one question that leftists need to ask themselves is, can we get to a place where the state, as it's construed right now, can reform enough to again discipline capital? Right now, capital tells the state what to do most of the time, and very rarely you have, it actually takes a figure like Donald Trump, who comes from outside of the privilege networks and personal cronyism of that revolving door elite world, to push through some measures which are going to force losses on well-connected capitalists. And he just does it out of spite. There's no strategy behind it, and he protects people who pay him off. But it would take that kind of outsider figure to actually reform it. Is it reformable? If so, then that's actually, in comparative and international perspective, and we can talk about Brazil in a moment, in this context, that's how you might be able to maybe not smash, but tame, or at least restrain the power of these peak capital interests. They're scared of a state that's capable. They're not scared. They're scared of a labor movement that's militant and powerful, and that's basically it. At this point, leftists should pursue on all of the above strategy. Like, how can we make the state strong enough to actually impose some restraints and force some redistribution on peak capitalists? Also, how do we create a militant and strong enough labor movement so that there's pressure from below as well? Ultimately, even if you have the labor movement but without a capable state, you'll need to construct that state just to administer the restrictions that you want to impose on the private sector. You could try to abolish the private sector entirely, but even that requires some kind of institutional architecture and apparatus and cadres to staff it, to be able to keep the essential operations going that feed people, that keep the trains running only 45 minutes late, without having just a cratering of any complex economic activity, and the need to start from scratch. And that's one thing that I keep urging leftists to do. Like, if you don't know what to do with your life, if you need a paycheck, look at the police, look at the military, look at the state bureaucracy, because there aren't nearly enough left voices, left figures, left personalities. And if you aren't taking the job, it's going to go to a reactionary, it's going to go to a radlib, it's going to go to a careerist, and they'll be the ones holding the business end of the rifle, the baton, or the whip, rather than you. And that becomes all the more important if you favor, and I'm not endorsing this, radical revolutionary approach, because a unified reactionary or conservative or establishment security apparatus, state apparatus, is going to crush any popular movement. But if the system is fragmented with this unit, this police department, this federal agency, having enough leftists in it, so when the order comes in to mow down the protesters, you can say no, you can switch sides, then you have a shot at victory. The only reason that the U.S., that the Soviet Revolution succeeded was because entire units of the Red Army, of the Russian army, the Tsarist army at the time, switched sides.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think we want to talk about Brazil, but I just want to jump on that. It's like, for people who watch the show a lot, like watch our stuff talking about Greece and Syriza, right? Where, you know, there's an obvious political call. There's like, you know, the European Union is choking this country. You have a popular movement that comes into power, but it didn't have rootedness in communities. It didn't have rootedness in the apparatuses of the state and in the economy, which is like, oftentimes people talk about Syriza. It's like, oh, well, they didn't have the heart. They didn't have the will. They didn't have, you know, they weren't brave enough in the end, and whatever. I'm not here to launder the resumes of those folks. But the fact is that if they pull out of the European Union, which again is like the right structural call, were they prepared to deal with the financial punishment that they were going to get? Were they prepared to deal with producing a lot more goods in Greece, which they were importing then, right? Like, these are the kind of things that you have to be ready for. And like, in a moment right now where we are sort of disorganized and in trouble, this is a very good time to start thinking about these things versus maybe somehow getting lucky and getting successful and then not having the tools at our disposal to be able to deliver the world that we're fighting for.
Exactly. And on that note too, I think that the left is too pessimistic or too resigned, too bleak about the EU itself as an institution that could have progressive direction. There are a lot of things that the EU does which are actually leftist priorities, things like open borders across Europe, things like fostering non-ethnic identities across the continent. Environmental standards. There's a lot that the EU does that's effective, so effective that it's invisible. We take it for granted. We don't think about it, and that are actually quite positive. So, European comrades, work for the EU, right? Like, keep your mouth shut. You may not like carrying water for the neoliberals for a few years, but eventually you'll get promoted, and you'll be the only one who knows about poultry health standards in the Mediterranean region, and you can skew them in favor of small producers. You can make that case, and the EU has state autonomy as an institution. That's one thing that actually people hate about it, right? The EU can do things that don't flow from an electoral mandate or follow the purely commercial dictates of European producers and capitalist interests. So let's staff that up with some of our people so that the next time there's a Greek-type financial meltdown, rather than forcing austerity, you bail out the people and nationalize the banks.
Good pitch. I mean, I just remember when I was unemployed, I was applying to all sorts of stuff, including like, I don't think I ever got a call back from any government jobs, but I remember filling out going through the portals, and honestly, whatever would have took me, if it was that or the architecture magazine. But I think you make a strong case for preferring like you're right. Like, I mean, we talk about like the we can move to Brazil now, the coup attempt, and they basically had like truck drivers blocking some roads and some and like I mean, in America, I do think one good thing is, we have more of a diverse military. Like a white supremacist takeover from the military, you do have really concerning evangelical pockets in certain parts of it. But I mean, without getting into that, let's talk about Brazil a little bit. What from the deep state analysis of what we should look sort of headwinds Lula has, or any observations you want to make about Bolsonaro? What do you have? What's your take on Brazil?
So one reason why Bolsonaro, despite the advantages of incumbency and the animosity felt towards Lula by a lot of powerful interests in Brazil, the reason that Bolsonaro couldn't secure his reelection is because he was, like Trump, too erratic, too egomaniacal to be a good steward of capital. Lula, from his first stint as president, has a record of pragmatic coexistence with Brazilian capitalism. And that's what allowed him to eliminate hunger, for instance, to pass the Bolsa Familia, to take steps in a direction that created more opportunities for poor Brazilians, the mass of the population, eliminate hunger, really rack up some major accomplishments in governance. And one question will be whether or not there is space for some kind of pragmatic, I hate you, you hate me, but we've got to figure something out. Type of relationship with Brazilian capital. And given the global economic crisis that goes along with the war in Ukraine, pressure on international supply chains that still, the echoes of COVID, also the challenging relationship with China and the United States, and Brazil balancing its opportunities between the two, Latin American regional politics, there might be some leverage that has. Brazilian companies are going to need some bailouts. There's going to be some macroeconomic management. And if he can provide what businesses need to survive, then that may make providing what people need to thrive palatable for enough of the, you don't need them all. You're not going to get all the bourgeoisie, but enough so that you can actually govern. Also, the geopolitics favor a balanced approach rather than capitulation to American hegemony. One of the great markets for Brazilian exports, especially agricultural exports, is now China. And I haven't dug too deeply into the trade figures, but Russian and Ukrainian fertilizer and industrial imports are also strategically important commodities that Brazil needs in order to maximize its economic potential. So his ability to play nice enough with the United States while avoiding signing up for complete Russia sanctions or cutting off trade with China is also pragmatically attractive from the perspective of the Brazilian bourgeoisie, more so than a figure like Bolsonaro that might just do whatever certainly a Trump-based Washington told them to do, and cultivate like a military-to-military relationship with the U.S. So these are areas in which he can potentially get enough leverage, have enough of a carrot and enough of a stick to allow him to restore social spending and potentially pursue some other more ambitious programs. There are the serious constraints that come with being a developing country with a large impoverished population. One thing that not only Brazil, but countries across Latin America need to do is upskill their workforce. You have a large pools of scandalously under-invested human potential, right? If you think about how many millions of Brazilians have been struggling for basic nutrition, well, how many potential scientists, engineers, skilled technicians, machinists, right? These are people whose lives right now are at the cusp of survival, but with a little bit of training, with a little bit of education, with a little bit of investment, they could become the makers of more developed, more productive, more egalitarian Brazil. And without that kind of investment, then you're going to have the kind of trade relations that are described in dependency theory, where you're exporting raw resources, you're exporting agricultural goods, but you have to buy your tech, you have to buy your machinery, you have to buy anything that comes out of sophisticated supply chains at premium prices from first world or Asian manufacturers. And Brazil, certain countries have populations that are too small to break out of this dynamic. They might become niche producers, but they'll never become the workshop of Latin America. Brazil and Mexico are likely the only two countries that have the endowments, the market size, the population, the mass, so that they can become a center for regional development. But again, this is something that's very challenging to do if you have a unified bourgeois opposition, because right now, so much of the industry and higher tech manufacturing that doesn't exist in Brazil is in private hands. If you try to nationalize them, everyone's going to go to Miami, right? Like you're just going to, you'll get an empty office building. So you need to have carrot and the stick, where you can cultivate maybe you pit the economic ambitions and frustrations of the middle class against the oligarch class and its monopolization of power, wealth, land, corporate ownership, and create that kind of worker-student alliance that gets talked about sometimes in Asia or in post-colonial settings. That would be a potential way to tap into that developmental potential. But and Lula has been good at doing the right amount of reassurance to relevant social groups to prevent that, let's call it Venezuela syndrome, where congratulations, you control the government. Congratulations, you control the oil supply. Doesn't matter. Everyone who could be an effective manager or who could introduce new technology into Venezuelan industry and oil extraction has left. And I'm not saying that I'm not making excuses for leaving Venezuela just because you don't like a leftist government. But that's a reality. You have to accept that you don't control all the pieces on the board, and people will behave.
Like in a global
their own
dynamic
interests.
without capital controls or anything like that. You know, it's like
Yes.
in a world where it's easy to pull your money and resources out of the country, like that can just be absolutely devastating.
Absolutely. And there are very few countries that have that kind of monetary sovereignty. China, Russia, you basically need to be a geopolitical power in your own right, or you need to have a very regulated, sort of fenced off capital markets, which, again, require economists, require regulators, require lawyers. And all of those people, you can produce your own, but it takes a generation to upskill the cadres within your party, within your movement, to the point where they can staff those agencies and institutions. For a certain amount of time, you're going to have to work with the people who are already there. And you don't need all of them, but you need enough. Whether you're going to take a developmental approach and maintain connections with global capital markets, or whether you're going to try to ring fence your economy and develop in Chinese kind of top-down developmental state model. These things they're hard to do. They need a lot of expertise. They need a lot of time. And Lula, so far, this is a slightly different area, but for instance, the letter that he released to the evangelical churches, reassuring them that he wasn't out to get them, that they could expect the same respect for freedom of religion and their particular sectarian interests from his new cadency as in his previous terms, and that's a wise, pragmatic move, one which might not necessarily be that popular with his own base, but will give him some runway as the president of all of Brazil. He has to deal with the fact that 50% of the electorate voted for Bolsonaro, and you can't shoot all of them.
David, do you want to follow that up? Or
No, I mean, I think it's. I mean, like, and your points about expertise. I mean, like, an example of this that I think maybe is easier for people to understand. There's like a very famous. Maybe I'll share it for patrons or something later. We can do something on it. But it's an old Trotsky essay where, like, during the revolution, obviously a lot of like rank and file people joined the Red Army, but then there was the question about like the officers, right? And there was a lot of people in the communist movement there who were saying, like, we got to get them out, throw them away. We don't want to deal with them. And Trotsky's saying, no, like, this is a scientific understanding of a practice, and we need to have the best people to be running this system. And it was very controversial, but I think, say what you want about the Soviet Union, but if you look at its capacity, in its early days and in World War II, Trotsky probably made the right call in being able to set them up for success in the long run. So, like, I think, on our side, like, understanding that, one, these aren't new debates. These are things that lefties have been talking about for a long time. And two, it's like running systems is very difficult. I mean, maybe even more like less controversial example of this. This is like why, I push for things like Green New Deal instead of some of these fanciful environmental programs, because you want people who know how to produce energy systems in this country to be running the transition to green renewable energy. You don't want to have to not only shift the resources that we're using to produce energy, but retrain, reimagine, recalibrate the entire apparatus of how we do something as basic and important as keeping the lights on your house. Like, these are really important questions that I don't think, and I know sometimes it can feel a little like silly, like we're playing video games sometimes to think about these things feeling outside of power, but like having that understanding now is really critically important. So if it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever, we're not, working from nothing.
For instance, in there were a couple of moments where it looked like Bernie Sanders' presidency might be imminent. And one thing that preoccupied me was like, one, how I talk to his foreign policy people so I can get a job. But two, who's going to protect him?
Yeah.
Because the Secret Service is one of the most reactionary elements in the American security apparatus. There are practically no leftists.
Look what happened to the first. I just cut in. Look what happened to the first black CIA agent or a black Secret Service agent for just a fun little homework tonight.
The spook who came in from the cold, or was sat by the door. There's a movie about one the first black officer. I can't remember what agency it was, but it was 100% marginalization. And if you can't control the people who are protecting your leftist president, how long are you going to have a leftist president? And it would be one thing if the Secret Service were the only trouble spot, but the agencies that oversee the Secret Service, the Department of Homeland Security, I believe, that's an entire reactionary bureaucracy. So you can start by changing off the people at the top, but unless they have a pool of cadres or potential cadres that they can staff their departments and organizations with, then you can have the most progressive, most leftist, most socialist policies in the world, but they'll be sleepwalked. They'll be slow rolled. They'll die at the desk of an undersecretary that has a MAGA hat in his locker. And you right now there's how would you even know who in the security apparatus is an irredeemable reactionary? You don't even have the investigators that would be able to tell you that. The state, especially the security services, but also technical agencies, regulators, are more or less a black box to most leftists. There are, when Matt Taibbi was looking deeply into financial regulators, that actually opened it up a little. But we don't have a lot of those kinds of sources, and it's boring reading with a lot of people that about a cast of characters where you're like, this person's ideologically suspect, this person's ideologically suspect, this person's terrible, this person's terrible. And leftists are not good at the kind of pragmatic triage where you're like, well, I found the 5 least terrible people. I figured out how to bribe them or flatter them or cajole them into working with us, and they will help us get rid of the ones that are irredeemable and place our own people where they need to be.
The right has the concept, like I think it's Curtis Yarv and maybe it's some other guy, but RAGE, retire all government employees. And from the right, it's a little bit easier concept because they just think like, oh yeah, let's just abolish every single one of these bureaucracies and we'll be fine without it somehow. For the left, you need to be a little more thoughtful.
Well, and also that rightist position has a secret corollary, right? If you are getting rid of the education department, let's just fire everybody who works for them. You replace them with Betsy DeVos and for-profit education empire. You have the private sector version of these bureaucracies ready to go and eager to take that role because it will be a breathtaking opportunity once in a century of total plunder. Similarly, let's phase out the NSA or the FBI. Those guys are bad. They were mean to Trump, but you replace it with a giant IDIQ contract to Palantir, right? Let Peter Thiel run the deep state. And the problem with the left, especially our segment of the left, we don't even have the Democratic Party, right? We've got like Jacobin and a bunch of podcasts, and half the time we're arguing over what somebody tweeted 2 years ago, and we need to have some institutional vision as to what it takes to govern if we ever actually want to do that seriously. It also is very reassuring to normies that you've got like some dudes with ties, some people who look like, sound like they know what they're doing, and who can be just responsible enough so that your QAnon aunt can't convince you that they're Antifa come to steal your babies for like mixed race communes in the Chaz zone of Portland, right? After all, if there's going to be an electoral or even a coalition movement path to power for the left, you're gonna need to reassure some normies at some point.
I think that's excellent advice, brother. Thank you so much.
My pleasure
for joining us. You can see, I mean, is there anywhere else we should be sending folks to? I know we see you on TIR all the time. Hopefully we'll be able to see you on this program more regularly as well. You can follow Deep State
I wouldn't
Kuba.
say no. But you're gonna have to make me some barbecue when I'm in Austin.
Oh, that's already happening.
When are you going to Austin?
Well, when are we gonna have the Austin live show?
Whenever
Well,
we
okay,
do.
I'll be there too then. Good.
But I'm on TIR with Jason Pell and Gene most Thursdays, sometimes on other shows depending, and on Sublation Media I talk to Doug Lane and Stephen Bertram Lee, and we've covered the Russia-Ukraine war in some detail, and that's a good place to learn more about our takes on the conflict.
Great. Deep State Kuba, thank you so much for joining us, man.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Yes, folks, I confess I was calling him Deep State Kuba because I despite my Polish ancestry, I can't even embark on trying to pronounce that last name.
No, he's
I've easier Lech, like Lech Walesa. That's
do you ever say it like
name.
that? Lech?
My grandpa used to sort of occasionally insist on that, but no, that's kind of going out of fashion.
Well, it was a lot of fun having him on. I just want to be very clear for the audience too, because I actually had the same reaction that some of y'all did. The term he used is not used in the way that I think most Americans might hear it. It's actually like a term for a spy. So just want to be very clear. Kuba is not just like dropping slurs in the middle of
a slur. Yeah,
randomly.
I see. I hear it as spy, and I wonder if like it's just like less like anti-blackness in the culture in North Dakota, and so like
I mean, in fairness, I don't think I've ever really heard anyone say that. I've heard people say nastier things. I know that more from Clint Eastwood than anything.
He says that in Gran Torino.
Yeah, a bunch.
Right.
But
right.
yeah, anyway, just want to be very clear.
Jesus.
So folks didn't think he was making like an off-color joke. He was literally using a terminology for spy or somebody who's not on your side. But anyway, that I don't want to let that hang over the thing, but I want to make that clear for folks. So
Kuba's great. He was. I mean, we said it in the the opening, but he was. People check out the audio for the live show. He's very funny guy too. On top of being smart about this stuff.
Well, we're gonna pop over the post game. We're gonna be haunted. I don't know. I had a great Halloween.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll let you go on your Halloween, but I also referenced the first black a Secret Service agent. That's the guy named Abraham Bolden. And I didn't have this already at hand, so I sort of just alluded to it. But Abraham Bolden is a guy who basically Biden pardoned. He's got locked up out of some, I think, I can't remember. I don't know the exact specifics of the accusations, but from the JFK assassination perspective, he said, it told investigators decades and decades ago, in the 70s, I believe it was, that there was other assassination plots similar to the Dealey Plaza one in Chicago, particularly about snipers posting up at turns, and all of a sudden he goes down for crimes, and I think it was a conspiracy, frankly, and I think that's worth looking into. But that's what I just wanted to, in case people were wondering, so they don't have to look it up themselves. But I should get back into my JFK stuff. I used to have this stuff more.
I like that.
Yeah.
But we're gonna jump over to post game like right away. We're gonna be visited by some haunting characters, Dave Rubin as always, and also Sebastian Gorka. Making a quick appearance as well, and we'll be taking your voicemails, where you can leave us one at 940-289-7234. We weren't able to get to it this week, understandably, but obviously next week is midterms. So I'm going to be taking a bit of a dive this Thursday afternoon into what's happening here in Texas, given my takes on Beto versus Abbott in particular before we jump into that main election. We'll let y'all know we might be rearranging things. Sam has decided to wage war on Left Reckoning, Sam Cedar, so we might have to shuffle some things around, but we'll let you know as soon as we figure it out. But as always, appreciate you all so much. Lula Livre, still a lot to celebrate, and we'll be over the post game in about 5-10 minutes. So get access at patreon.com/Left Reckoning, and see y'all then.
Peace.